Namaskar. In this session, we will look at the nature of Indian society and the manner in which it has organized itself, or it had organized itself. That is what we call as polity. Society and polity. Polity is the in a collective sense, the institutions and organizations the society creates for itself, for conducting itself, its problems and its solutions, how it addresses them, and how it resolves them. Those institutions collectively are called polity. Society is the parent body, and polity is the offspring of the society. This session is based on Sri Dharmapal's book, Essays on Tradition and Recovery, Tradition, Recovery and Freedom. There are several articles in this. One of them is this, some aspects of earlier Indian society and polity. This aspect of this book was initially given as a series of lectures, later compiled and brought out in printed form. Is available online. You can purchase it and read it. This presentation is organized in two parts. Today we will address the first part, and some of the topics we will discuss are presented here. Apart from the background, we have Indian polity, land and agriculture, the taxation, then the various components of the polity, then dignity of the individual, how and in what perspective the individual is viewed by the society, by our cultural value system and the political organization. We look at the background of this. The author, Sri Dharmapal, was born in 1922 and he lived up to 2006. He was a great Gandhian thinker. He was a Gandhian and a historian. So he is a meticulous historian, very great writer. I have extremely high regards for this man who worked with great diligence and insight. He has written a few books, only a few books, but then the depth into which he descends to understand things is phenomenal, and it is very enlightening for us to study his works. Some of the books he wrote are The Beautiful Tree. We are going to discuss it in some time in future. That's about the education system before the advent of the British in India. And you say advent of the British had come to India in 1600s, that is the 15th century, but then they settled down as rulers in some part of the country starting from 1757. Sri Dharmapal looks at 1750 as a benchmark, and he wants to present the earlier Indian society prior to 1750. How was it? That's the substance of this book. In The Beautiful Tree, it is the same substance, but then pertaining to the education system, specifically to the education system that was prevalent in India. Science and technology in the 18th century, we have seen civil disobedience and Indian tradition. This civil disobedience movement, which you have seen during our freedom struggle in the 20th century, is an ancient Indian tradition. It is not new. It is really ancient. It was a normal, natural way the subjects would protest in Indian tradition. And the beautiful part of this is the administration, the ruler would recognize this mode of protest as a very valid method of expressing themselves by the subjects. Overall, it is a radical reappraisal of conventional views of the cultural, scientific, and technological achievements of Indian society at the eve of the British conquest. His works are compiled in 5 volumes, which are listed here. We are taking the present book from the last volume, Essays on Tradition, Recovery, and Freedom. It consists of 3 lectures delivered in 1986 under the auspices of the Indian Association for Cultural Freedom at Pune. These were later published in the journal New Quest and also translated into Hindi. It was also translated into Malayalam in somewhat briefer versions. The compilations of lectures in Hindi continues to be published now and then by Azadi Bachao Andolan at Ahmedabad. I have mentioned about this. The definition of society is a group of people living together in a geographical extent, sharing a common identity, culture, history, and aspirations. In the present case, it is Indian society. Polity would mean societal organization to conduct its own affairs, the institutions for governance, fiscal arrangement, education, dispensation of justice, etc. Why 1750? 1750 is taken as a benchmark by Sri Dharmapal. He says that 1750 is before the advent of the British, because soon after the British settled down, many of these institutions became defunct. They were not operative. They slowly died. In about 50 to 60 years, they perished almost completely. Therefore, to understand Indian society, its own identity, we need to look at the earlier Indian society, earlier to this benchmark. 1750, he takes it as the benchmark. He says, to my mind, the records prior to 1750 would be, if they are as detailed as the post-1750 British records, much more representative of actual Indian life. What we have in English referring to the Indian society and polity is mostly post-1750. This is a matter of regret, and Sri Dharmapal went to very great extent to unearth the manuscripts and documents relating to the society. He traveled to England, looked at the British archives where many of these manuscripts are still extant. Many of these manuscripts were acquired by the British in the second half of the 18th century and were taken to Europe. Many manuscripts were taken to Germany and many taken to England. He went to England, studied them in the British libraries, copied them, and brought them to India, and then wrote his books. And it is very characteristic of Sri Dharmapal. The book would contain about 80% of the book would be only appendices. That is, the documents which he has copied, that he reproduced them in original form. And only about 20% or the most 25% is his introduction or his compilation or his opinion about those documents. So therefore, the books became very authentic. You see the source material in its original form. The post-1750 records, which really describe the society of particular areas, usually refer to the decade or two following the formal occupation of an area by the British. Naturally, these narratives vary in their quality, extent, and depth from area to area, depending on the person who reported or the condition under which the reports were made. But to better understand the Indian society of that period and the manner in which it was broken and the concepts and structures which were tried to reshape it, the more important record is to be found in the archives in Britain, for it is in Britain that the formulation of policies and structures took place and the thinking which led to such formulations at various levels: political, academic, mercantile, obviously has to be located in a variety of internal British records. He says, I'm looking at 1750 and a little earlier to that. If I could get still earlier documents, I would be very happy, because that would be very supportive of the cultural tradition. We can unearth the cultural tradition of the country. But at least 1700, 1750, that period of records, that's what I'm looking at, he said. Land and agriculture. He says that there was a live functioning society and a functioning polity was in place when the British took over, even though there were certain weaknesses, primarily the political weaknesses, the inability to recognize the threats for the society, inability to come together to face them, inability to strategize to face them. These are political weaknesses, but then at various other levels, the society was functioning very fine. It was well organized, and we need to look at them closely, because our rebuilding of the society will have to take inputs from that end. It is not that we reproduce the same society now, but then the essentials have to be grasped. What were the values, what were the assumptions, what were the targets for which those institutions were really formed. Says Sri Dharampal, just 2 centuries ago, we had an organized and functioning society and economy in most parts of India. Not that the society had no travails of its own, that it had no wars at all, that it had no social and political disturbances. All these were there, but yet the living standard of the people seems to have been adequate and appreciably higher than that of similar classes in Britain around 1800. Productivity in agriculture was much higher than in British agriculture. Agricultural tools, implements, and practice were diverse and sophisticated. The crafts, not only of the celebrated textiles, such as Dhaka muslin and other things, but also the production of iron and steel, of various chemicals and dyes, of wood and sugar, the construction of ships, the art of building them, or the craft of the digging of tanks, as well as river and road transportation compared, road transportation compared, and perhaps with advantage to that which prevailed elsewhere in these spheres, anywhere in the world. Society and polity were highly organized and had an incomparable sophistication in its various arrangements. What are these sophistications? We are going to see now. Education was widespread, much more than it was in Europe. It's a separate issue, separate book, which we will review in future. But here, just the gist. A more detailed survey of it was carried out in 1822 to 25 in the Madras Presidency. In fact, not only in Madras Presidency, they also carried out this survey at two other places in India, one in Bihar and another in Punjab. The three the presidencies, that is Madras Presidency, Calcutta and Bombay. In each of these presidencies, they have conducted this survey, and the results are similar, if not identical, very similar, that there was a widespread education. Every village had a school. And the quality of the school, the teachers, the students, and the composition of the students attending were uniformly the same, and it is spread across the society, across all castes, and also gender. The survey indicated that 11,575 schools and 1,094 colleges were still in existence in the Madras Presidency, and that the number of students in them were 1,57,195 and 5,431 respectively. 5,431 in colleges. This is the hallmark of Dharmapalji. He quotes the exact number from the original source. Much more important, and in view of our current assumptions, unexpected information which this survey provided is with regard to the broader caste composition of the students in the schools. One of the myths that have been propagated over the last 2 centuries in the Indian society is that the education was cornered by a certain section and it was not available for the whole society. And Sri Dharmapal says that this is false. According to the survey, those belonging to the Shudra and castes below them formed 70 to 80% of the total students in Tamil speaking areas, 62% in Oriya areas, 54% in Malayalam speaking areas, and 35 to 50% in Telugu speaking areas. In his book, Beautiful Tree, he also gives the gender composition of the student population, as well as the teacher population. Teachers also emerged from all sections of the society, including who are called parayas. As has been established recently, this is about technology. We had a full review of this. As has been established recently, iron was being manufactured in India in places like Atiranja Kheda in Uttar Pradesh, at least as early as the 12th century BC. Mind you, 12th century BC he's talking about, 1,200 years before Christ. See, this 12th century BC is considered to be the Bronze Age in Europe. European historians would call, see the bottom line, 3,300 BC to 1200 BC is considered to be the Bronze Age and characterized by the use of copper and its alloy bronze as the chief hard materials in the manufacturing of implements and weapons, whereas India was using steel. So 12th century BC, but what is little known is that even around 1800 AD, the industry was widespread and flourishing, and the technical details of this manufacture were highly sophisticated. A rough estimate of the number of furnaces which manufactured iron and steel may be put around 10,000 around 1800. The furnaces were not very large. They were small furnaces, portable in bullock cart, that kind of furnaces. But its structure, if you say the architecture and the technology, so technology and the corresponding architecture are very similar to the modern furnaces. And each of them seem to have had a potential capacity for producing about 20 tons of very superior steel annually. If the furnace worked about 35 to 40 weeks in the year, these furnaces were very light and could be moved by bullock carts. That 18th century India produced artificial ice by freezing water, and not in Himalayan winter, but in moderate cold weather in places like Allahabad, and developed a technique of storing them for months together to be used in summer. Or that India long had the practice of inoculation against smallpox, and that the art of plastic surgery had continued to be practiced in late 18th century India, centuries after Sushruta and Charaka. Sushruta and Charaka belong to the pre-Christian era. According to the Europeans, it may be 1st century to 6th century BC, but in Indian tradition, much earlier. And that this practice of plastic surgery was noticed by the British initially here in Pune may come as a surprise to many. Similar surprise may be felt at the details of Indian agricultural practices, the agricultural implements which the Indian peasant used, and the much higher productivity which he achieved. Incidentally, a set of the implements, including drill plows, was sent to Britain by one of the pre-1800 British collectors from the Madras Presidency district with a view to help improve some of the agricultural implements then used in Britain. And charity. This comes from the paradigm which is accepted and practiced in India. It is a society of sharing. It's a society based on a grain economy. In a grain economy, that is not the gold economy, the grain economy, whatever the produce that you have collected in abundance has to be expended before the next crop comes in. So charity was a very natural way of living in India. It also appears to have been the practice in places as far apart as Kedarnath in the Himalayas on the one hand, and the Tanjavur region of Tamil Nadu extending to Rameshwaram on the other, to provide chatrams for the stay and comfort of the pilgrims. Usually, it is the king's responsibility. In many places, it was handed over to the queen to look after these chatrams. but food was free. Hotel industry was not present in Indian tradition. It is a 19th and 20th century phenomena here. But earlier it was chatrams which are very hospitable, very considerate to the pilgrims. Extending from Rameshwaram on the other, that is from Kedarnath to Rameshwaram, extreme north to extreme south, not to speak of east and west. Chatrams were, the whole land was dotted with chatrams to provide chatrams for the stay and comfort of the pilgrims. Public funds in the shape of assignments of sources of revenue, including revenue from seaports and similar other sources, were given over to such institutions to cover the expenses of these chatrams, etc. In the case of the chatrams at Kedarnath, it was further stipulated that if an unspent balance got accumulated over a number of years, such a balance was to be wholly spent on the Kumbh Mela, which happened every 12 years. And a fresh start was made again, beginning from an empty treasury. This may remind many friends here a similar practice, which seems to have prevailed in India in the time of Harshavardhana. Perhaps much more is known of such practices in earlier and later times. Harshavardhana is known to have expended his entire treasury, emptied his entire treasury through charity once in 5 years. Xuanzang, who visited Harshavardhana in Kannauj, who stayed for this festival of charity, which went on for several days because the treasury was rich. And Harshavardhana expended everything in that, every bit of his money on the charities. And he collected, says Xuanzang, collected an old cloth from his sister and then paid homage to the Lord. By and large, wherever there was irrigation, around 4% of the total agricultural produce was allocated for its maintenance. That is the irrigation maintenance. According to 1818 British survey, the district of South Arcot in Tamil Nadu had over 7,000 great, medium and small temples. One district, 7,000 great, medium and small temples, and several hundred mathams and chatrams. Most other districts in the Madras Presidency, where such a survey was ordered, reported 3,000 to 4,000 temples, etc. And at a rough estimate in 1800, the Madras Presidency might have had about 100,000 temples, mathams and chatrams of varying importance and size. The number of such institutions for the whole of India might have been in the range of 5 lakhs in around 1880. 5 lakh is the number, approximately the number of villages in the whole country. And the survey indicates that almost every village had one temple or a matham or something of that kind on an average. Land and agriculture. How the land was organized. This data was collected through a survey of about 2,000 villages in Chengalpattu district during the 1760s and 1770s, obviously by the British. The survey recorded the total land belonging to each village, the utilization of this land for various purposes, the net cultivated land in each village, irrigated or otherwise, and the details of manyams, something called manyams, the land which had been assigned to various village institutions and functions. Even in our childhood, we could see this. The temples had its own land, manyam land. Such assignments were of the tax which any land might have been liable to pay to a duly constituted political authority, whether such authority was at the level of the village or at any other region or national level. That is, it's essentially coming from the government. Besides, about 1/6 of the cultivated or cultivable land was classed as manyams, 1/6. In many of the districts of Bengal in 1770 AD, in the ceded districts of Kadapa, Bellary, Anantapur, etc., in Bengal as well as in Andhra and Karnataka, where British power and authority was consolidated by Thomas Munro during 1800 to 1807, and in many other areas, the amount of cultivable land traditionally and historically classed as manyam was as high as half the total land of the area. It's at 1/6 at places, but it may range from 1/6 to 1/2. In the districts of the Bengal Presidency, it ran into tens of thousands in each district. In one district, the number of claimants of manyams was around 70,000 in the year 1770s. There is another item called Shasana village. What is Shasana village? In Jagannath Puri, the president of the Puri Jilla Parishad told me that near Puri, there had been 52 Shasana villages, which had continued as communities with common ownership. Common ownership, you can see it in Israel, kibbutzu they call it. But in India also, common ownership, Shasana villages were prevalent before Israel experimented with it. Israel came into being in 1948. Common ownership, etc. For several centuries they existed, but that these were dissolved after 1937 when we began to implement the national objective of land to the tiller. The one who cultivates, give the ownership of the land to him. This is the new order. My impression after visiting that village, the Shasana village of Veera Narasimhapura, was that as regards aesthetics, design, the state of its agriculture and plantation of coconut and other trees, social amenities, etc., the village compared well with any Israeli kibbutz or a village in England or elsewhere in Europe. Compared well. I was then told that this was a Brahmin village, which created some doubt in my mind that perhaps it was a very special place. All these amenities are there because this is a higher strata of society. Maybe if it is a lower strata, it may not be up to this mark. That kind of a doubt. But I was assured that out of the 52 villages there, there were many which were inhabited by various other communities, including fishermen, and that these were organized similarly. Then there were Samudayam villages. In 1964, I was informed that in Tanjavur, I was informed in 1964, in Tanjavur, that till 1937, until this Land Reform Act came in, till 1937, it had at least 100 villages which had long been organized as Samudayam villages. But that these again were even formally dissolved because of our national objective of land to the tiller. Samudayam, as the name suggests, is a common ownership village. More about Samudayam. Most of these systems seem to have assumed the supremacy of the village community over the land, its disposal, or the way it was worked. There were villages where the village community, perhaps the community of only those who cultivated land and those who held manyams, and not necessarily all the families in the village, maybe a special group only, but seems to have been organized as a samudaya. While its members had specific shares in the land of the village, the land which any of them cultivated was changed from time to time. Such a change in the district of Tanjavur, where around 30% of the villages were classed as Samudayam in 1805, was stated to be based on the assumption that a certain alteration occurs in the fertility of all land from time to time, which creates inequality amongst the members of the community. Hence, occasional redistribution was considered necessary. See, when you say that it is a common ownership, the method of this ownership distribution is that, of course, the families are given certain piece of land, maybe equitable distribution of land. But not only that, after 3 years or 5 years, the land is shuffled. Your ownership shifts to something, some other piece, and they will get this. By way of this redistribution, they ensure that nobody suffers because of a poor fertility of the land or poor irrigation of a particular piece. So after 3 years, he has a rotation. In many of our modern institutions, we do this. A head of department changes every 3 years. So the same kind of thing here also. Taxation. Taxation is probably one of the most important aspects of a polity, because as Chanakya says, Arthamulo Danda. Arthamulo Danda means administration, and the tax is extremely important to sustain the administration, make it effective. Danda is Danda means Nigrahanugraha Shakti. In Indian parlance, Danda means Nigrahanugraha Shakti. That is, the state power is called Danda. So taxation sustains the state power. And this tax has to be collected for sure. Otherwise, the state cannot sustain. But when you collect it, it has to be in a manner. This is the word is from Chanakya. Chanakya says, tax is to be collected like the honeybee collecting the essence from flowers, without disrupting, without damaging the petals of the flower. It only extracts the honey from the flower. So taxation has to be done that way. It should not be hurtful. Indian scriptures and historical documents are very emphatic on this. I have taken this passage from the website of the Income Tax India, Government of India, Income Tax Department website. They have written an article on the history of taxation in India. They quote, Quoting Manu, Sage Manu, however, cautioned the king against excessive taxation and stated that both extremes should be avoided, namely, either complete absence of taxes or exorbitant taxation. According to him, the king should arrange the collection of taxes in such a manner that the subjects did not feel the pinch of paying taxes. He laid down that traders and artisans should pay 1/5 of their profits in silver and gold, while agriculturists were to pay 1/6, 1/8, and 1/10 of their produce depending upon their circumstances. Please notice that the agriculture was taxed less. See, this is probably the secret of this abundance in the society. The food was in abundance in Indian society. Nobody starved. Famines were unheard of until the 19th century. Unheard of in India. The detailed analysis given by Manu on the subject clearly shows the existence of a well-planned taxation system, even in ancient times. Not only this, taxes were also levied on various classes of people like actors, dancers, singers, and even dancing girls. See, this is the ancient thought. It is current. Today also it is the same thing, that everybody is taxed. Only thing that you would see is that according to Manu, the highest tax that he mentioned here is 1/5, that is 20%. Today it is not 20%. The highest tax is not 20%. It is 30% in India. It was higher than that earlier, but now it is 30% in India. And in many places in the world, it is 30%. I think in the United States also, it is 30%. The detailed analysis given by Manu on the subject indicates that the existence of a well-planned taxation system, even in ancient times, and every earning member was taxed. Taxes were paid in the shape of gold coins, cattle, grains, raw materials, and also by rendering personal service. The other point is that the Indian economic thinking on economy, Indian thought on economy, it is not a totally based on money, not based on gold. It allows grain, cattle, raw materials to be treated on par with gold coins. So produce is considered wealth, not necessarily confined to money. Chanakya compares the taxation to honeybee collecting the essence from flowers when in full bloom. Please note the underlying term, in full bloom, not when it is not ready. Government should collect taxes like a honeybee, which sucks just the right amount of honey from the flower without causing any harm to the flower. Just as one plucks fruits from a garden as they ripen, so shall a king have the revenue collected as it is due. Just as one does not collect unripe fruits, he shall avoid taking wealth that is not due, because that will make the people angry and spoil the very sources of revenue. Please note, this is the time of monarchy. A traditional monarchy, almost many parts of the country was under monarchy, and Arthashastra lays down how to collect taxes without hurting the public. Monarchy was successful in India much more than the rest of the world, because it rested on dharma. According to Arthashastra, the state not only collected a part of the agricultural produce, which was normally 1/6, but also levied water rates, octroi duties, tolls and customs duties. Taxes were also collected on forest produce as well as from mining of metals, etc. Salt tax was an important source of revenue and it was collected at the place of its extraction. According to Kautilya, tax was not a compulsory contribution to be made by the subject to the state, but the relationship was based on dharma. And it was the king's sacred duty to protect its citizens in view of the tax collected. It's an obligatory for the king. It's an obligation for the king to protect his subjects who pay the tax. And collected as if if the king failed in his duty, the subject had a right to stop paying taxes and even to demand refund of the taxes paid. See the maturity of thought. This is at least 300 years before Christ. And this is Kalidasa. Kalidasa in his Raghuvamsha refers to King Dilipa and says, see, this is, I quote this not as a historical evidence. I'm quoting this as a norm, as a value, which was instilled in the society and which poets routinely state. When they eulogize a king, they state this. It was only for the good of his subjects that he collected taxes from them. This is King Dilipa of the Ikshvaku dynasty, a great grandfather of Sri Rama. It was only for the good of his subjects that he collected taxes from them, just as the sun draws moisture from the earth to give it back 1,000-fold. And the land tax was quite low compared to the times of the British, certainly, and compared to the times of the Mughals. Thus, it is that while a fairly large proportion of the production went towards the maintenance of the social infrastructure institutions, the proportion which went to the apex state, whether at the more central level, was a fairly small percentage. That is, taxes collected by the government agency, yes, but then bulk of this collected tax was left at the village level. And it is the village panchayat which will decide how to spend it, on what to spend it, what are their priorities. This has to be decided at a local committee of the village panchayat. And the percentage of money that goes to the center is a fairly small percentage. Many times it was as small as 5% of the tax collected. According to early British authorities, there had been no land tax in Malabar till 1740 AD. None in Canara till the 15th century. And an insignificant amount in Ramanad, that is in Tamil Nadu. And even in the 1790s, had no more than 5 to 10%, even as late as the early 19th century in Travancore. That any land tax for the purposes of apex state, which had been levied in India, had historically been very low, also is apparent from the amount of rent or share of the agricultural produce which the cultivators of the Manyam lands paid to those who held these Manyams till at least 1800 AD. What we are talking about is land tax, not the agricultural tax. Agricultural tax was separate. What I'm talking about is land tax. That is why many places there was no land cess. The village or the locality, having contributed for the maintenance of the cultural and religious institutions, for the support of the accounting political and militia systems. Probably also made a contribution of around 5% of the above deductions, which would have meant an immense amount as it must have been received from tens of thousands of localities for the direct support of the apex authority or apex authority, which Mahatma Gandhi described as outermost circle. That such arrangements led to a militarily weaker system may possibly be true. This is one of the reasons why India was overrun by invaders. But it is quite possible that the elements of such military or institutional weakness lay elsewhere and not primarily in the decentralized fiscal and social arrangements of Indian policy. It could have been very well that the political unity was a far-fetched thing in a highly decentralized system, and military organization was quite different from the aliens. When the aliens invaded, they formed strong military, which was unified in purpose, maybe of looting, maybe of arson and rape, maybe religious fervor. But the local bodies were not unified in their purpose or leadership. So it was not a standing army, it is a collected army on the occasion when it is needed. So that could also have been the cause of military weakness. The pillars of polity. This is a list which the Rampalji gives. You see the leftmost column, don't see the rest of them. The rest of them is allocation of money, how the village panchayat would allocate money under various heads. The leftmost column here is temples, Brahmin scholar, the Kannugi. There are so many, Palegar, Pirzada, etc. So it runs into several heads. There are 18 heads here: village infrastructure, the Purohit, Devatvam, etc., etc. Many of these names are unfamiliar to me. So totally there are some 38 heads under which the village panchayat would distribute money as indicated. The other columns refer to various other villages. Just to show that these are all part of the polity. These all components need to be sustained so that the society carries out its own functionality. Village Palegar. Who is Palegar? This word is familiar to me because it is there in Kannada, Palegar. Palegara means the equivalent of an Inspector General of Police. He is responsible for the protection of people, and whatever the police does, all those responsibilities belong to the Palegar under the king. So each village would have a Palegar. See the responsibility part of that. Incidentally, it may be useful to know that the officers of the Talaya, the corn measurer, the settler of boundary disputes, and a few other village officers were generally filled by persons from the Paraya and elite castes. As many will know, in Maharashtra, it was the Mahars who constituted the village police. Many subordinates of many lieutenants of Chhatrapati Shivaji, belong to these category of people, Killedars and others. This was an ancient tradition. It is nothing new with Shivaji. It is also worth noting that in cases of theft, etc., if the police or the Palegar were unable to recover the stolen property, they were expected to compensate the aggrieved party from the incomes allocated to their officers. Please note how the accountability was working. There is a theft and a complaint reaches the police, Palegar, and the Palegar's responsibility it is to identify the thief and recover the stolen property and return it to the owner. If he doesn't, then he has to compensate. It may not be, compensation may not be from his personal funds, but from the funds allocated for his expenses as Palegar. There are a few records dated anterior to 1680, even at this early date, which mention that the practice in Madras was, it possibly prevailed in most part of India, that the militia and the police received a certain proportion of the total agricultural produce of an area. And in lieu of such remuneration, it was their duty to protect all those who contributed to this charge from local, protect all those from local disturbance, thefts, etc. In case the police failed to recover any stolen property, it was its responsibility and that of its superiors to compensate the sufferer up to the value of his loss. In Tanjavur in 1805, the number of Mirasdars, those having permanent rights in land, was put at 62,000, of which over 42,000 belonged to the Shudras and castes below them. The number of cultivators of the group formed Paraya in the Bara Mahals, the present Salem district, was estimated at 32,474 out of a total population of about 6 lakhs just before 1800. 6 lakh is the population, 32,000 is the owners. The number of Mirasdars actually listed by the Changalpattu collector in the district in 1799 was put at 8,300, but the collector was of the view that the actual number of Mirasdars there was about 10 times more, around 80,000. In 1817, the number of Mirasdars in 1,080 villages of Tirunelveli districts was estimated to be 37,494. It is unnecessary to add that throughout India, the rights of the actual cultivator were permanent and hereditary. And those began to be scrapped by the British starting from 1790 onwards. First, to enable them to realize a greatly enhanced land revenue, and second, because British ideas of ownership did not admit of any such cultivator rights even in Britain. This is a cultural difference. Wages, just see this, the wage difference and the wages compensation was in India. With regard to agricultural production and the wages in agriculture, according to the journal Edinburgh Review, 1803 to 1803 and 1804, the wages of the Indian agricultural laborer in Allahabad, Varanasi region around 1800 were in real terms substantially higher than the wages of his British counterpart. Something to be taken note of. The journal at that time wondered that if these wages were so high at this late period of great economic decline, after centuries of being overrun and ruled by aliens, how much higher such wages must have been when they were first established. According to a recent computation by an economist of the University of Madras, the wages of the agricultural laborer in Chengalpattu during the period 1780 to 1795 at the 1975 prices, calculated on the basis of the 1975 prices, have been about rupees 7.5 per day. While in 1975 itself, such wages were rupees 2.5 per day. I can substantiate this around 1975, maybe 70 to 75, somewhere in between. I do not recollect the exact date, but it is during my college days. I remember a laborer came to my father and asked for work, and they were discussing the wages. It was around this. He asked for 2.25, and my father protested, saying it is high. So 2 rupees 50 paise in 1970s. That was the wages. The differential, the wage differential between the really high and the really low, the extremes, what is the highest and what is the lowest, provided by some 1799 data from the Karnataka area. After much inquiry about the incomes of the officers of the state in Tipu's domain, the British inquiring into Tipu's domain, the British came to the inference that the highest paid officer of Tipu, the governor of the fort of Chitradurga, had a total salary of rupees 100 per month. Is the highest. The wages of an ordinary laborer in this area at this period was rupees 4 per month. 1:25. The new differentials which were brought into being around this period by the British are indicated by the salary of the British district collector. Can compare him with the governor of Chitradurga, was rupees 1,500 per month. While the Chitradurga Palegar gets rupees 100, a British collector started drawing 1,500 per month. It was a princely sum in those days. And a member of the British Governor's Council receiving rupees 6,000 to 8,000 per month. While the wages of the laborer were constantly reduced during 1760 to 1850, and reduced to what level? What the Indian laborer, craftsman, etc. received as wages around 1850 was in all probability no more than 1/3 or at the most 1/2 of what he would have received till around 1760. So the disparity increased, and the consequence was there to be seen. I'll presently show you what the consequences of this disparity, this rough handling of the society. The surprise of all surprises, the rulers. The exotic rulers like the Mughals. It is a cliche in India to say that movie Mughal, that kind of words, to show that they were They were spending huge sums of money on themselves. But the Indian ruler was not so. Look at the impression of the foreigners at that time. The impression which ordinarily comes through from the British record is of a certain simplicity and fragility in India at the top levels. Probably it must be frugality. Sorry, the word is simplicity and frugality in India at the top level. Even in the Muslim ruled Hyderabad in 1780, a perceptive British officer found it difficult to distinguish the great nobles from their servants. According to him, the only things which seemed to separate the two was the fact that the clothes of the servants looked less clean. But the quality of the clothes were almost the same. According to one of the more powerful early British governor generals, and what he said is echoed by many others before 1800 and even till 10-20 years later, the Hindu rulers in fact spent very little on themselves. Simplicity is considered to be a virtue. But according to him, they suffered from two great vices that these were that they gave away most of what they had to the Brahmins and to the temples. Dignity. This is perhaps the most important aspect of a civilization, that an individual dignity is allowed to live in dignity and he gets protection from oppression. He is allowed to maintain his self-respect and life. If he has a grievance, he can protest. This is accepted as a norm. See, while protest in the form of a dharana, traga, etc., was resorted to when the populace felt that they had been wronged by some particular action of the political authority, and when such a protest occurred, it was taken by the relevant authority to be a legitimate expression of the political process and as an occasion for reviewing the disputed action. This is part of dharma. He has to do that. He cannot brush it aside without looking at it. And in the ancient times, there are so many records of, in our epics and other things, there are records of people protesting. And when the king goes astray, there are rishis who would come down from their ashramas and then set the king right or remove the king and install somebody else and go back. Bhrigu did it for the Vena of Ikshvaku dynasty. He asked Vena to step down and installed Prithu on the throne, and then went back. Yeah, but ordinary people can protest. Yet, recourse to such protest was perhaps not often necessary. It seems that the polity allowed for continued dignified dialogue between the populace and the representatives of the political authority. The king and the palegars, etc., and dignitaries due to the populace in such dialogue were sanctioned by long-standing custom, which continued to operate to some extent even during the early phase of British occupation. Examples: the prolonged protest against the imposition by British authority of a tax on houses in 1810 and 11 was centered in the city of Varanasi. According to official reports, The whole city had completely stopped work for days, together creating a situation not even the dead could be cremated and had therefore to be cast into Ganga without the performance of customary rites. According to the Varanasi collector, over 20,000 persons had been continually sitting in dharna, while another estimate placed the number of people collected between Sakrole and the city at more than 2 lakhs. The data on the frequency of peasant movements in Kannada, that is Dakshina Kannada and Uttara Kannada, Malabar and parts of Maharashtra is indeed vast. A more curious case of protest relates to two men at Nagaur and Nagapatnam in Tamil Nadu just before 1800. They felt wronged regarding their claim to some land and in protest climbed the spire of a temple and threatened to kill themselves by jumping from it unless their grievance was redressed. As a result, the men who promised that men, yeah, as a result, the men were promised that the wrong would be righted and they agreed to climb down. The newly established British collector, however, did not take kindly to such a solution. The acceptance was from a lower level official because the tradition sanctioned that, but the new rulers did not accept it. Though this and similar data requires a much deeper analysis, it does simply imply that every person in this society enjoyed a certain dignity and that his social and economic needs were well provided for. Food and shelter seem to have been a natural right, given India's cultural norms and made easier by India's fertility. See, this is when civilization flourishes. It expresses in multifaceted, multi dimensions, and creativity flourishes. The polity under sufferance. Sufferance means kind of duress, pressure, compulsion. If what I have been saying is based on reliable historical data, how is it that the picture of Indian society and polity which prevails today is so very contrary to what I have represented? Why is it different today? It is not easy to answer such a question. Nearly 2 centuries have elapsed between the society and polity which I have described and the present. In between, we have not been our own masters. Even the privileged amongst us, including even the great Maharajas, Nawabs, bankers, and what remained of our traditional teachers and scholars of ancient learning, have been deprived of all public and social initiative. And the vast majority of our people during most of this period existed under sufferance and at the very edge of physical survival. 2 major causes can be identified. One is economic decline, another is education, which has deprived of our social leadership the necessary initiative, the very normal initiative to take up issues and resolve them. It's a defunct state of the society. I was also of the view which I retain even today, that the ordinary human being in India, especially the Indian villager, was in no sense inferior to his counterpart in England or other countries of the West. As regards his ingenuity, capacity to innovate within his circumstances, and in terms of the total amount of hard work done by him during the comparative periods. Further, the fact that he was able to produce most of what India needed in agriculture or craft products with meager capital and investment indicated that he perhaps was far superior to the mid 20th century peasant or craftsman of the West. Mid 20th century, because it is a modern Europe he is comparing with. Even in a modern times, with all the amenities, he says, Indian villager of 3-4 centuries earlier compares very well with them in the rest of the world. This is a document, extract from a document which talks about the world history, economic history. So I have taken it now, the whole world, starting from the year 1 to the year 2001. For 2000 years, the economic history of the world is being compiled. It is share of the world GDP, and it is insightful, and it is heartening to look at India's contribution on this. See, the leftmost column lists the countries, and initially it is the European countries, 12 countries in total. In the first millennia, from 1 to 1000, it's not worth mentioning at all. Their economic contribution to the world, the GDP, is not worth mentioning at all. It is around 1500, that is after, as the dark age was ending, then the Europe woke up. And it is after that they have been contributing, or they had a share, not contribution, they had a share of the world GDP. All put together, the number is given here: 15%, 17%, 19%, 20%, 30%, 30, 24, 22, 17.5. This is 2001, 17.5. But in 1800s, they were on the top. 1870, it is 30%. 1913, it is 30%, the European contribution. All the colonies were contributing to this. The total of Western Europe is given in the list here, and you will now see what is India's contribution. In the first millennia, a jump from year 1 to 1000. China's contribution, GDP, is 26.1% of the world GDP, and India's was 32.9%. And it started declining from then on, but even in 1700, I don't need to cite the reasons for decline, right? It has declined because India had to face several other problems by way of war, subjugation, etc. It went on declining, 28.9%, 24, 22, but 1700 it is again 24.4. China was 22.3. And by 1820, it came down to 16%. The British occupation had a telling effect on India's economy. 1870, it came to 12%. In a matter of about 50 years, it came down by 4%. By 1913, it is 7.5%. By 1950, you can take it as 47, it is 4.2%. See, in about 250 years, it declined from 24.4% to 4%, 1/8. No, 1/6, sorry, 1/6. And then the decline continued for a while to 1973 during our socialist movements. 3.1% it further declined. And by 2001, it started picking up to 5.4%. Whereas China went ahead to 12.3% by then. This is the same graph, the extract taken from the same table it is. Please note that during the British period, it was a steady decline. Yes, so this is the end of part 1. In the next session, we will discuss more about the British Raj and what impact it had on the Indian society, some details of that. So the first part is over. So if you have any comments, questions, I would like to hear.
Sir, are we continuing? Our second part will be next week, is it?
Yes, yes.
Okay, sir. Fine then. Thank you, sir. So now the session is open for Q&A. Please. Yes, Anand, please go ahead.
Hello. Hi. Namaste, sir. Very nice talk.
Yeah. Thanks.
You can hear me?
Yeah. Thanks to Dharmapal.
Yeah. I think I've read, I got the books. I've read a couple of them actually.
Yeah.
So my question is about this Huansang incident, right? That you mentioned about Harshavardhan.
Yeah.
I've been trying to look it up where exactly it is mentioned, because I have Huansang's records. It's called as the records of the Western regions or something. I got the book from Numata Publications in Berkeley, California, and it's supposed to be the original memoirs of Huansang that he had written in Chinese. And in that, I do a reverse index search on Harshavardhan. I can't find it, and maybe it's there somewhere else, because I've heard about it a couple of times and I've asked people, but I can't find the original source. So if you have the source, can you point it out to me?
Yeah, I have a secondary source. I don't have the original Huansang's book. I do not read it. But I have heard this story as a child also. But then I quoted the source in one of my earlier lectures, and I have cited the source material from that. It was on Dharma. Go back to the PPT on Dharma and see.
Okay, but does the secondary source point to the original one where we can confirm it or just check it?
I will have to look into it and give it to you.
Okay.
But I have quoted the source from which I have quoted. I guess it is there in Center for Policy Studies, one of the books of Center for Policy Studies. I think the title of the book, if I remember right, is Annam Bahukurvita.
Okay.
See, the Center for Policy Studies was inspired by Sri Dharmapal. It's a Chennai-based organization. It's a center of learning. They have several books. One of them is on the ancient tradition in India of Annada. So I think it is there in that book.
I see. Okay.
Let me look at it and confirm it to you. Or go to the PPT on concept of dharma.
Right. Okay.
It's uploaded in our website. Just look at that. And one of the files will have that.
Yeah. Okay. And second question I have is about the observation I think Dharampalji makes, or you mentioned today, that even in the Mughal Hyderabad, Muslim Hyderabad, the variation was not that much, and the rulers were not that, you can say, profligate or kind of this thing. But if we look at the records of, I'm trying to remember, is it Bernier or one of those people who came during Jahangir's time or Shah Jahan? I think it was Jahangir's or Shah Jahan, I don't remember. And he talks about the kind of really bad famines that were there in the Deccan. And it's kind of that reference is used by people to critique this whole Taj Mahal building, that how, and I mean, okay, I know we have a question of whether Taj Mahal was really built by Shah Jahan, but whatever money was spent by him, it was like, okay, on the other side, you have this really bad famine in the Deccan. And I think it's one of those French authors. So how can we put these two things together is my question.
I didn't
That-
get your
That
question.
on one side, Dharampal is saying that the British saw that the rulers didn't spend too much and they were kind of ordinary. But on the other side, we have the records of these French travelers during the Mughal times, corresponding to Shah Jahan and Jahangir, that how much money they were spending while the common people were having a really bad famine in
Yeah.
Deccan, for example.
Yeah. See, Dharmapalji is talking about Indian society and Indian rulers.
Mhm.
Not really talking about Mughals, though incidentally he refers even at Hyderabad.
Okay.
And one example of Hyderabad, you should not extend it to the entire the Mughal rulers
Sure.
set.
Okay. Okay.
So I would say that if you study the Mughal or the invasion, the earlier Pathan rulers, they were looters.
Mhm.
They had come for that purpose.
Right.
How do you expect them to conform to the norms of dharma and
Right.
the responsibility for the citizen, etc.?
Mhm. Right.
Please don't
Okay.
apply it to that.
Sure, sure. Well, I got confused because of the word Indian, I guess. So I understand when Indian means it's kind of more of Hindu or
All these,
other.
what we said,
Yeah.
is dependent upon the Indian tradition, which
Yeah.
is nothing but the Hindu tradition, not.
Correct. Right. Yeah.
So we do not
Okay.
mistake it and apply it to the Mughal rulers, as the leftists would say, that they are
Okay.
Indian.
Right.
They are not inspired by the Indian paradigm.
Right. Yeah.
That is the one thing. And Hyderabad is just one example. At Hyderabad, personally, of course, the Nizam of Hyderabad was very frugal in his expenses, even in his dress. Personally, yes. That is true. That is true. But he was also one of the richest persons of the time.
Mhm.
Yeah. How he collected his riches, we do not know.
Mhm.
So we need to look at it more closely.
Right. Okay.
It was just an observation, even in Hyderabad.
Mhm. Okay. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, sir. So, any other question?
No questions. Okay.
Okay, sir. I don't think there's any other question. We can end the session today with the Shanti Mantra.
Yeah.